Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the second of our Louisa May Alcott Society sessions for today. Our second session today is a roundtable about teaching Alcott and her relationship to the era's other US realists, regionalists, and romantics. I'm Greg Eiselein. I'm the president of the Louisa May Alcott Society and a professor of English at Kansas State University. I'm going to introduce all five speakers one at a time. We're going to have a brief pause between each talk to allow for some virtual applause that you can indicate with your emoji reaction if you want, or just by turning on your video and clapping. And I will then signal our next speaker to that they're up. At the end of our five talks, we're going to open it up the discussion to all of you to ask questions, join the conversation. You're welcome to do this in the chat function, and I'll monitor the chat for speakers and amplify whatever questions are there. You are also so welcome just to unmute yourselves, turn on your video and ask or raise your hand in the Zoom feature or the Zoom button there. However you choose to do this, we hope you have lots of questions for our speakers today. Our first talk is from John Kucich. It's called Women in the 19th Century, Revising Moods and Revisiting Margaret Fuller. Professor Kucich is a professor of English at Bridgewater State University. He is the former editor of the Concord Saunterer, the Journal of the Thoreau Society. He's the author of Ghostly Communion, Cross-Cultural Spiritualism in the 19th century American Literature from 2004, and several recent essays on the intersections between Native and European American cultures in the 18th and 19th centuries. He's edited a collection of essays, Rediscovering the Maine Woods, Thoreau's Legacy in an Unsettled Land, was published recently by the University of Massachusetts Press. John Kucich.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thanks everyone for taking part. The first session was wonderful. I look forward to the conversation. It's great to see some familiar faces and names. I'm talking about Alcott and moods in the context of a course in Transcendentalism, which I've taught several times over the past decade. And in these interesting times, I had the opportunity to revisit and redesign the course several times. And I tried to figure out where to put Louisa May Alcott in this course. And that's what I think moods is really where I settled in the last time I taught the course. I want to throw some ideas out there about how it really does offer some powerful opportunities for students to really engage in some really rich critical activities. So first, let me begin by summarizing the course. I taught this largely as an upper level course for seniors or for graduate students. Bridgewater State's public university in Massachusetts. Many of my students are first generation, most are women, and about half plan to become teachers. The fact that most of the writers we study lived in the area adds some level of interest, but most are new to these texts. I've broadened the course over its iterations. Frederick Douglass now plays a key role. And in a previous version, I entered the course with Little Women, looking to add another woman's voice in addition to Margaret Fuller's. And it wasn't really a good fit. It was long for one, and while offered a new perspective on the Concord of Alcott's childhood, the book's key topics didn't resonate with the other works the way I hoped they would. It felt like a new conversation rather than a way of capping off an old one. And so when I taught the course last year, I switched to Alcott's first novel written in 1860. Alcott herself was very proud of moods, which she contrasted to the potboilers she wrote in the same era. The novels she wrote in her journal sprang from her genius. It centers on a love triangle between a tempestuous and non-conforming young woman, Sylvia Ewell, and her two suitors, the pensive poet living in a nearby old manse, Geoffrey Moore, and the highly principled, truth-telling, nature-loving seeker, Adam Warwick. These two men are friends and older than Sylvia, who marries Moore despite her love for Adam, which blooms on a boating trip up the local river. Complications ensue. Sylvia learns to live by principle rather than impulse, and the triangle resolves when Adam, after a heroic turn in battle during the Italian Revolution, dies in a shipwreck close to the shores of home. Sylvia, rather than resuming her marriage to Moore, resolves to live independently. Here was a work that touched all the transcendental chords. But while Alcott's family loved it, publishers didn't. And it took the help of Caroline Dahl to secure one in 1864. A.K. Loring took the book on the condition that Alcott shortened it substantially, which she did, reluctantly at first, and then with the conviction that the revision greatly improved the novel. And she also changed the ending. Reuniting with Moore, Sylvia reveals she has only months to live and dies at peace. Moods sold well, moving through 4 printings, though Alcott had doubts about some of the changes. A couple years later, she bought the copyright and in 1882 published a revised version which restores some of the original chapters, removes a subplot involving a Cuban beauty, a love interest of Adam Warwick's, and changes the ending yet again. In this version, Sylvia, having learned her lessons of self-control and resignation, resumes her marriage with Geoffrey Moore. My students loved the novel. For one, it was a headlong narrative after a semester of essays and poetry. For another, it offered lively portraits of some of the key figures we've been studying, fully spiced with a frisson of Eros. Thoreau as a Byronic hero fighting off rampaging Croats, Emerson as an earnest, wounded lover. Was Mark based on Channing? Was Faith based on Caroline Dahl? Did Margaret Fuller haunt the pages somewhere? And it posed complications, in part because some students, as they will, bought the wrong edition. Some had the Rutgers edition edited by Sarah Elbert, others bought the 1882 version, and that led to some class stumbling blocks during class discussion, but also opened up some really interesting possibilities. I'd like to turn now to some of the ways that teaching moods helped to both deepen understanding of transcendentalism and sharpen some of the key critical moves in literary study. So, first, moods offers a powerful case study in textual criticism. While students have certainly heard this approach in earlier classes, it's rare to find a text with 2 such radically different versions, especially when accompanied by the author's journals and letters to help unpack the differences. Students have ready access to both versions. Elbert publishes the restored chapters in the Rutgers edition, and both are available as free ebooks. What started as a source of confusion quickly became a rare opportunity to apply 2 techniques for working with multiple versions. I'm sorry, let me one was developed by the poet W.D. Snodgrass called decomposition. In this approach, students take a published version of a poem and then change a number of elements, paying careful attention to how this changes the overall effect and meaning of the poem. This method works beautifully for poems, and moods allows us to watch it take shape in a novel. As a class, we list the changes Alcott made to the 1864 version when she rewrote it in 1882, and we get a sharp insight into how a novel is made. Moreover, by seeing what she restored in her final version, we get a glimpse of a now lost original manuscript. We can thus build the second technique, the fluid text version of the novel that places different versions side by side. Digital Thoreau, developed by Paul Schacht at SUNY Geneseo, offers a marvelous example using Walden. Building a proper digital fluid text of moods is beyond the scope of any one class, but be a really awesome project for someone to pick up. But working in small groups, students were able to divide up some of the changes between the versions and place them side by side, which set up questions that most hadn't had the chance to explore with other texts. Why do these changes matter? How do they reflect Alcott's intentions for the novel? What do they reveal about the key themes and questions that fired her initial fury of composition and then fueled her later revisions? What do the different versions of the text tell us about what the text as a whole means? Here's the last paragraph in each version. Second, Moods offers a powerful case study in contextual criticism. Alcott's biography provided one context. We brainstorm elements of Alcott's life that resonated with the novel, her rambles with Thoreau, her use of Emerson's library, the elements of her family life that touch on the characters and events of the novel. Yet even more so than Little Women, Moods offers a powerful counterpoint to Alcott's own life. Sylvia's mother and father, her siblings, her material comfort, her lack of vocation, and particularly her marriage story, all set her apart from her author, who shares only this tempestuous character that she needs to transform. It's as if Alcott was disentangling the core of her identity from the circumstances that shaped her life. Students relish the opportunity to explore what these series of thought experiments, the off-rhymes between character and author, meant. In addition, the long evolution of moods offers a powerful window into the context of authorship. How does the novel fit alongside the Gothic thrillers and abolitionist fiction that surrounded its composition around 1860? How did this republication in 1882 respond to Alcott's success as the author of Little Women? Was she able to finally publish the novel she'd written in 1860 with the improvements of a now experienced novelist? Or did she reshape the novel to help preserve the marketability of the Alcott brand from a story that had struck some readers, Dahl included, as kind of scandalous? There's no clear answer, and students love to grapple with that. Another key context for moods is the writing of the Conquered Circle. And so to the intersexual circle of the fluid text version of moods, we add the intertextual circle, linking passages from Alcott's novel to passages from other writers we study this semester. And again, I asked students to work in small groups to make these connections, ending up with side-by-side annotations between these texts. And here's a passage on friendship. This is from Moods, and resonant passages in Emerson and Thoreau. Again, this is a chance as the last novel in the course to go back and dig in and rethink some of the stuff we've been reading with this new lens. Understanding moods, in short, sends students back to review their own reading of the Transcendentalists who helped shape Alcott's own world. In this case, they weren't reading as 21st century students, they were trying to read as a young 19th century writer. Our final approach to the novel wove together both the transcendental context and the varied scenes of writing that mark the long publication history of Moods, the topic of Alcott's feminism. Unlike Little Women, Moods seems fully immersed in the transcendental stream of conversation about the role of women. And while no obvious stand-in for Margaret Fuller appears in Moods, the novel is an invitation to revisit her work. A final activity involved pairing key scenes in the novel with passages from women in the 19th century, on the education of women, on the intersection of women's rights and abolition, on the great radical dualism, on the different types of marriage at the core of Fuller's really great meditation. Carolyn Dahl proved to be an ambivalent reader of Moods, admiring its power, but criticizing its portrayal of marriage in particular. Students very much enjoyed the opportunity to imagine what Fuller would have made of Sylvia, especially the three different endings to her story. Which would she have preferred? And how ultimately does Alcott make peace with Fuller's ghost? The answer to that question leads into the rich conversation about the nature of Alcott's feminism and brings us finally to the question of what her legacy means today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. That was outstanding. Our second speaker today is Elif Armbruster, who's an associate professor of English at Suffolk University in Boston, where she focuses her teaching and research on American women writers, and particularly on literary activism. She's the author of domestic biographies, Stowe, Howells, James, and Wharton at Home, and also essays on Willa Cather, Edith Wharton, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and many others. Her paper today is Teaching Alcott and Stowe, the Literary Activism of Regional Writing.
I just said that I enjoyed the first panel, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later as well. So today I'll be discussing Louisa May Alcott's Hospital Sketches and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Palmetto Leaves, two texts which I taught for the first time last spring in 2020 in an upper level English course entitled Women Writers and Literary Activism. Both works were wholly unfamiliar to my students. They had only heard of, and some had read, Little Women and Uncle Tom's Cabin, but many had not read those either. They loved them. They loved these works, Hospital Sketches and Palmetto Leaves. Both works, which are presented as collections of letters, offer thought-provoking and relevant exposés of subtle and overt racism in their respective environments, and work, therefore, to disrupt regionalist attitudes. I explored in class how Alcott and Stowe use empathy towards the disenfranchised African-American populations around them in order to educate their contemporaries, as well as today's readers, through this subtle form of literary activism. For me, this cultivation of humanity and empathy in my students is crucial to the enterprise of teaching literature, especially in today's day and age, and especially the most recent past. Alcott's semi-autobiographical Hospital Sketches first appeared as letters in Commonwealth magazine and was published in book form in 1863. Harriet Beecher Stowe's collection of letters from Florida were first printed in the Christian Union, a newspaper owned by her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, and came out as the book in 1873, so they're about a decade apart. Both works offer a glimpse into specific regions at very particular times in our nation's history, 19th century history, the Civil War, Washington, D.C. area in Alcott's work, and the post-war Florida area in Palmetto Leaves. Both illuminate populations of African Americans who were and typically were presented as, well, were not typically presented, were largely invisible. For those unfamiliar with these texts, just briefly, Alcott's Hospital Sketches presents her experiences through the voice of the narrator, Tribulation Periwinkle, the nurse who travels from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. to work in a hospital for wounded and dying soldiers. Alcott's work illustrates the vital role that women played during the war by functioning as impromptu nurses, just as Alcott did for a short period of time in her life. But Periwinkle also transforms the role of nurse into one of deep personal connection, mainly through the use of humor and strength for the victims of the war. Stowe's collection conveys an image of Florida in the post-war South as a land being cultivated and maintained by newly freed African Americans, the population that Stowe attempts to help by employing them on her acres of orange groves. And she considers them to be the most able laborers for her land and the region in general. Her work is also credited with helping to develop tourism in Florida, a development that continues to sustain the state to this day. Alcott's nurse Periwinkle encounters far more African Americans in the hospital in DC than she is familiar with seeing at home in the North. And her descriptions of the Black soldiers give them an agency and a likability that she acknowledges they have rarely received before. For example, Alcott writes, "I found that any show of interest or friendliness in them brought out their better traits." As Tribulation becomes acquainted with the population of wounded African American soldiers, she expresses the sentiment that if only the whites would take the time to get to know the African Americans, they would find themselves accepting and respecting them. Nurse Periwinkle expresses her dismay at the way the whites treat the Blacks, something that Stowe does as well from Florida. Alcott notes, for example, that the men would swear at the darkies, would put 2 G's into Negro, and scoff at the idea of any good coming from such trash. Alcott puts the words darkies and trash in quotes to state, of course, that this is not how she would refer to them, but that the whites around her do in the context of the writing. She continues, the other nurses were willing to be served by the colored people, but seldom, if ever, thanked them. Nurse Periwinkle and Louisa May Alcott herself are clearly dismayed by the treatment of African Americans, and they advocate for their equal rights by opening the eyes of the reader to the judgment and mistreatment which the Black population faces at the hands of their white counterparts. In the last paragraph of the book, Alcott articulates the racism she witnesses in the hospital, writing, quote, "The next hospital I enter will, I hope, be one for the colored regiments, as they seem to be proving their right to the admiration and kind offices of their white relations who owe them so large a debt." Here, Alcott, via Tribulation, comes right out and states how much the white population owes the Black soldiers after a long legacy of discrimination and oppression, which is going on at the time of this writing. In Palmetto Leaves, Stowe similarly advocates for African Americans, though in this case after the Civil War. Stowe bought land in the northeastern part of the state of Florida in Mandarin in 1868, and she lived there every winter for 20 years until her husband died in 1888. In this book, Stowe highlights the compelling and contradictory elements of life in the post-war region of Florida, northeastern Florida, writing that it is both as beautiful as a new heaven on a new earth, but also, quote, desolate, forlorn, and untidy, thus a land ripe for cultivation by a new laboring class, which is how she views the freed African Americans, whom she frequently encounters on her regular walks and boating excursions around the area. Stowe writes, quote, that the sun awakens all their vigor and their boundless jollity, and that when they help her with her work, never, quote, was harder work done in a more jolly spirit. Similarly, she notes that, quote, the Negro is the natural laborer of tropical regions. He thrives and flourishes physically under a temperature that exposes a white man to disease and death. While still Stowe resorts to some stereotypes in highlighting the physicality of the African Americans, she also sympathizes with the fact that they have been, in her words, constantly oppressed, robbed, and cheated. And she endeavors to counter this exploitation, specifically in her employment of the population. She is forthright about the conflict of spirit, that the situation arises in her, and that what to do is not clear. Her expressions of ambivalence and uncertainty highlight the honesty with which Stowe attempts to confront her own preconceptions regarding African Americans. She insists on treating them as equals and notes in one letter how well she pays them when they are employed to cultivate her land. Both she and her husband were open about the need for others to employ the freed population, specifically so that they did not, in her words, continue to deteriorate due to a lack of purpose or usefulness. Thus, Stowe's book, like Alcott's, works to change perceptions and offers new avenues of self-actualization for a population that has only recently, in Stowe's case, received physical freedom. Both Alcott's hospital sketches and Stowe's palmetto leaves offer regional views of African American populations that were not widely available or embraced at the time of their respective writings. Both Stowe and Alcott appeal to the reader's empathic response and inveigh against the way their contemporaries viewed the African Americans in their vicinity. In Alcott's case during slavery, and in Stowe's just after the war ended. While Stowe comes across as more ambivalent than Alcott, both authors ultimately evince a new level of understanding and empathy for Blacks. And it is this use of emotional tolerance and acceptance that my students were most responsive to, and which compelled me to teach these works as guides for today's readers. An enterprise that is as important today in the classroom as it was a century and a half ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elif. That was great. Our third panelist today is Gaynor Blandford. She is a professor in the liberal arts department at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, a performing arts institution that encompasses Boston Conservatory at Berklee. She teaches a range of courses from introduction to college writing to the Harlem Renaissance. She particularly enjoys teaching Louisa May Alcott and Emily Dickinson in her courses on literary representations of death, as well as American women writers. Additionally, both Alcott and Dickinson have figured prominently in her classes on art and war. Her paper today is titled "The Possibilities of War and Death, Liminal Space in Alcott and Dickinson."
Thank you, Greg. My approach to the works of Louisa May Alcott and her contemporaries is currently informed by two main concerns: war and death. In Alcott's My Contraband and selected poems by Emily Dickinson, all written or taking place around the time of the Civil War, we find significant evidence of linguistic subversion and formal manipulation occurring within and beyond the boundaries of genre. While this may not be new to us as readers of these authors, it may be more unfamiliar to our students. I found that My Contraband offers a great introduction to these concepts near the beginning of my course on literary representations of death. Both authors demonstrate how death, war, and the manipulation of language help create a liminal space in which the marginalized and disenfranchised, as well as the unspeakable, can find place and voice. Liminal space begins with the linguistic challenge of Alcott's My Contraband's title. The earliest title of the piece was, of course, The Brothers, when it was first published in The Atlantic in 1863. It carried with it its own freighted emphases on miscegenation, the damages caused by white male sexual misconduct, rape, suicide, fratricide, and so on. The later title, My Contraband, published in Hospital Sketches and Camp and Fireside Stories in 1869, puts us firmly back in wartime, slavery, and with the one word my in consideration of ownership, not leaving aside the issues raised by the brothers, but adding further layers to them. The creation of liminal space is begun in contradictions. So on the first page of the story, we have our first inconsistency. Miss Dane, an avowed abolitionist, happily slides into her role as titular owner of human property, my contraband, although she is by no means immune to the frequent ironies of her position. Miss Dane also points out that some see being an abolitionist as also equaling a heathen, although we note that her arguments against Robert's revenge, as Robert being the contraband, her arguments against Robert's revenge in the narrative are consistently based in Christian doctrine. So over and over again, we see contradictions and inconsistencies. Alcott's story creates spatial opportunity by and with the use of language. It is in language that Miss Dane's dis-ease with the status quo is most commonly felt and seen. She declares emphatically that she has more interest in the black man, Robert, than in the white, Ned, the captain and his half-brother, and decries that all colored men are called boys, even if their heads are white. During the midsection of the story, Miss Dane repeatedly uses a rhetorical device, chiasmus, to balance or weigh two meanings, even while typical of chiasmic structure, pointing the reader towards the favored meaning. There are linguistic shifts in the narrative, which are rapid, but not always predictable or stable. Language, the use of chiasmus, allows Miss Dane to move between seeing Robert's slave status and seeing his humanity. We also glimpse her attraction to the handsome features she catalogues, even while she hastily withdraws her appraising gaze. The verbal slippage is clear even to Robert, who has to remind her, I isn't a white man, miss. I is a contraband. Ultimately, the true power of language would seem to reside in Robert's hands, not Miss Dane's. After he chooses not to kill his half-brother on his sickbed, Robert begins a new life in the North, in Massachusetts, and takes the last name of Dane, effectively marrying Miss Dane and becoming her husband. He joins the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Robert Gould Shaw, and kills his half-brother in battle with honor, and surrounded by his God-given brothers of color. Nevertheless, the story is ultimately Miss Dane's to tell. Robert dies of his wounds received in battle. And the battle with his brother is defined by her notions of what is Christian and what is civilized, what is legitimate. His rage is tempered by a belief system that she observes he doesn't subscribe to. So the liminal space that I've described is ultimately one that is fluid in a way that is open to our interpretation, but also to one that Miss Dane controls. Emily Dickinson obviously was not involved with the physical reality of the Civil War. We come to her, and our students come to her as knowing her as a reclusive, solitary poet. My students possibly seeing her as frail and a poet who writes cryptically, ungrammatically, somewhat out of her own time. But Dickinson's poetry stretches beyond the gender and genre confines of her era and produces unexpected reactions to an unanticipated subject matter. It is our own ways of seeing that must be adjusted to look beyond our expectations of a small female poet of the 19th century, to see a writer grappling with the gruesome realities of her day. One of the consistent student questions or complaints about Dickinson is that she writes too much about death, but just a little contextual history uncovers her reality. The Emily Dickinson Museum asserts that of the 1,789 poems that she wrote during her lifetime, 989 of them seem to have been written during the Civil War years. Historian Drew Faust's This Republic of Suffering brings our attention to the gaping wounds inflicted on the nation's psyche by the numbers and manner of the dead resulting from the Civil War. Not enough coffins, or burial sites, or grave diggers, or undertakers, or religious officiants. No official mechanisms in place for properly attending to the Civil War dead. Those who lived in the vicinity of battlefields were overrun with decaying corpses. And the new medium of photography vividly brought the horrifying images of the battlefield to families and friends at home waiting for news. Emily Dickinson's stark poetic response to war divides into two areas: disillusionment and probing examinations of death that mirror her peacetime preoccupations, but do nothing to shield us from the terrors of wartime. Her poems that I'm sharing with you in the chat, or Greg's sharing with you in the chat, are divided into two. Disillusionment poems that include 444, 582, and 1227, and poems that I term horrors of war that include 286, 358, 408, and 656. In her disillusionment poems, these poems illuminate a sense that not having died in war may be worse than living to witness so many dead. They underscore the almost modernist sense of disillusionment with the empty rhetoric of patriotic fervor. And in the horrors of war poems, in her peacetime poetry, we uncomfortably heard a fly buzz when we died. But now we hear the whistle of the bullet and know it carries a certain death. Dickinson's poems offer a sense of collected shamefacedness at exacting such a painful and sordid price in the name of individual peace. Dickinson is not questioning policy or politics, but strikes at the core of social relations. We must uneasily interpret relationships couched between punctuation marks that have always had the vaguest of holds on our psyches. We must ask, how do a dash and a capitalized word work together, and believe we can truly pass an answer? The very horror is that we may, like Dickinson herself, in these her war poems, find death itself waiting in every vista and contemplation, every pause and emphasis, not as a philosophical conundrum, but a sticky, dripping swamp of blood.
Thank you, Gaynor. That was outstanding. Our fourth paper is from David Carlion, an independent scholar who has written 2 award-winning books, one on 19th century performance and politics, the other on learning to do the work of comedy with modern audiences. His scholarly articles have explored Huckleberry Finn, the Gettysburg Address, and As You Like It, as well as the Rube story, his phrase for the fiction that histories repeat as fact of rustics, blacks, and women presumed too stupid to realize they're watching a performance. The title of his talk today is called Alcott's Proximate Circus, Class, Gender, and Race Under the Lilacs.
Thank you, Greg. I can see my PowerPoint. Can you see? Is it there?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Mark. Congratulations, John, Elif, Gaynor. Nifty stuff. A historian of circus and 19th century politics, when I was looking at Under the Lilacs as a circus book for children, it struck me that it's, because of this panel, it struck me it's a kind of touchstone that radiates to all sorts of other writers of the era and other issues, including class, gender, and race. But first, to understand the children's books of the Gilded Age, you have to understand that the first 70, 80 years of American circus were for adults. This is a bill from Dan Rice's great show at the National Theater in Philadelphia. It had, on the left, you see the traditional circus things, and then you had the spectacle, the magic ring. This was 1860. Children attended, but as adjunct to the adult pleasure, packed with sex, violence, and politics. Antebellum shows also modeled democratic urges with a geographic reach and democratic range greater than any other American institution. Then the Gilded Age flipped the script, framing circus as children's fare that fit a larger cultural turn, what scholars call the invention of childhood, a new concept of youth as a time of innocence requiring extended protection. Circus then got framed as innately juvenile, with the big top of child-centric cliches that continue to dominate ideas about circus. Circus histories have long relied on them. Other scholars have followed suit, leading to many problems. Seeing circus more fully can broaden understanding and teaching. For instance, you can get a more complete view of the structure and theme of Huckleberry Finn if you understand the influence of circus woven throughout. There is a fascinating article, Hugh McElhenney, on Under the Lilacs that combines gender and disability studies, yet because of those cliches, not his fault, it's all about all that's available so far, it weakens the argument. Reconsidered, Alcott's Tale of a Circus Runaway shows the use of the child circus theme and variations that reflect the culture's struggle with class, gender, and race. From the start of American circus in 1783, observers compared it to democracy with an undertone of class division. Later circus popularity would symbolize democracy, but originally the comparison arose because of concern about the crowds. Like democracy's crowds, the crowds at the circus around the ring were eyed warily as probably vulgar and possibly dangerous. Flurry of antebellum anti-circus tracts pick up the thread, including one by Alcott's neighbor and distant relative, William Alcott. Ostensibly aimed at children, the tracts usually devolved to complaints about the adult audiences as deplorable. The suspicion of crowds returned in these Gilded Age children's books. These books usually told of a runaway, someone who ran away with the circus, but then by the end ran from the circus, which is where Alcott's Under the Lilacs began. The reason all of those boys, usually boys, all of those boys ran away was because circus was not respectable. As Horatio Alger's young acrobat put it, a circus performer has no recognized place in society. So too Alcott's Ben Brown, the runaway. As he settles into village life through the book, he discovers that people enjoy circus but don't think much of circus riders. He's accused of theft, which is considered reasonable because of his circus background. Presenting his riding act for his new friends, he doesn't feel respectable in his costume now. The emphasis on respectability dovetailed with Alcott's repeated celebration of village life, an echo of Thomas Jefferson's insistence that only rural yeomen could sustain democracy, for that was the ultimate context of these Gilded Age circus stories, the emergent notion of middle-class domesticity as a foundation of democracy. Yet Alcott did more than repeat cliches. She presents Ben's background as an advantage. He can hang a tree that nobody else can do. He evades a bully by scooting up a tree. His skills, quote, cause the boys to regard Ben Brown with intense admiration, the girls with timid awe. When he confesses he didn't feel respectable, a sympathetic woman, Miss Celia, reassures him that he has a double advantage: the enriching circus experience and the benefit now of school and church, enabling him to join boys who, quote, fit themselves to become industrious, honest men. Greg has argued that Alcott nudged Joe's boys beyond the family into modern society. Alcott into the modern social order. Alcott does the same here. Ben may have a troubled past, but it fitted him for the future. Alcott also echoed elite praise of circus, and that was a bit of an anomaly. In a mid-century respite from criticism, writers had posed circus as a civic virtue. In his book, Hard Times, Charles Dickens framed circus as a relief from the ravages of industrialism. Herman Melville wrote The Fiddler, a story about a writer who learns to overcome constricting ambition when he observes an apparently simple-minded fiddler enjoying his clown, only to learn that the clown had been a world-famous violinist who himself had given up vain ambition. Walt Whitman, reviewing a circus in Brooklyn 4 years before this, declared that its clown and manager, Dan Rice, amusing, quote, 1 million persons a year, should regard himself as a public instructor. Emily Dickinson joined the parade of praise. Friday, I tasted life, a circus past the house. Still, I feel the red in my mind, though the drums are out. Alcott featured girls in Under the Lilacs. That's not a surprise, but is another variation on the traditional children's books for circus books for children. Nearly all of the stories starred boys, with girls adjunct or absent. The magazine Youth's Companion paired poems about things that Adam and Eve missed, having not been children. The boys' pleasures were energetic, including attending circus, while girls' pleasures were homebound, sewing, crying, reading, with the only active pursuit a sleigh ride with a boy, and the second half of the poem detailing her courtship and marriage. The gendered expectation sometimes sexualized girls. Circus became beneath the increasingly anodyne image, had a symbolism of sex. You talked about the ballet girls of circus, you were talking about sex. One brief but notable example peeks through Henry James' first, later disowned novel, Watch and Ward. When a man initially encounters the young girl, he sees both childish innocence and, quote, something undeniably vulgar. She looks as if she belonged in a circus troupe. James made clear that circus-based vulgarity was sexually tantalizing. As the girl grows, the man muses, quote, the ground might be gently tickled to receive his sewing. The petals of the young girl's nature, playfully forced apart, would leave the golden heart of the flower, but the more accessible to his own vertical rays. By the way, Wikipedia excuses that as a joke to make his brother and William Dean Howells feel uncomfortable. Not surprisingly, Alcott varied the traditional phallocentric story. Though Under the Lilac seems to be the runaway boy's book, do I have Ben Brown there? It's driven by what a scholar calls the socially saturated world of girls, rare in men's writing for children. We don't meet Ben until the third chapter after Alcott has established an active girls' world. They then leap to action to help him. Later, when Bab, quote, burned to imitate Ben, she didn't pine in passive hero worship. Instead, like Joan Little Woman, she acts. The boys won't let Bab join their secret trip to the circus. She walks the 4 miles on her own, arriving weary and scratched. She ignores their offers to help. Ben, graduating from circus ring to the family circle, joins, quote, the socially saturated world of girls. Even as Alcott celebrated middle-class life, she knew it included stout-hearted girls who didn't fit the growing passive stereotype. Oh, that didn't come out quite right. So everybody looks sideways. Pointing to African-American newspapers and white magazines like Atlantic Monthly and Harper's can only hint at my larger exploration of the white supremacist backlash to Reconstruction. Alcott writes little that makes us uneasy, and circus had a better record than other American institutions, welcoming Blacks and whites together, sometimes in integrated seating. Yet the Gilded Age equation of circus and children implicated circus, as the era framed Blacks as childlike and similarly fond of circus, like children. Though African-American newspapers waged a long fight against the racist view, publications like Atlantic Monthly and Harper's reinforced it. Though Alcott didn't use the noxious stereotypes, her focus on white children did reinforce the whitewashing, helping diminish and erase Blacks from the cultural conversation. So,
thank you, David. That was great. Loved that. Our fifth and final presenter today is Kristen Prohl. Her paper is titled Sentimental Realism, Little Women, the Red Badge of Courage in Postbellum Contexts. Kristen is an associate professor of English at SUNY Brockport, where she teaches courses in children's, young adult, and American literature. Her first and really awesome book is called A Battling Girlhood, Sympathy, Social Justice, and the Tomboy Figure in American Literature, and it was published by Routledge in 2018. She's currently working on a second book project titled Queer Friendship and Young Adult Literature.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be able to close out this fantastic session and these amazing papers that we've had so far today. Over the past 15 years and across 3 different academic institutions, I have frequently taught Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in conjunction with Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, published in 1895, first in a survey of postbellum American literature, and then in my 300 level courses in young adult, YA, and adolescent literature. While this unit works toward a variety of different learning objectives, it aims principally to help students to think about the relationships between text and their literary and historical context. That's the sort of overarching learning objective for the class I'm teaching right now. In reading Little Women alongside The Red Badge of Courage, we examine how historical constructions of gender and sexuality have shaped the coming of age narrative, and how these narratives invoke adolescence as a metaphor for national identity. I use examples from both texts to help students understand how scholars have defined sentimentalism and realism, even as we consider how Alcott and Crane disrupt these categories of classification. Finally, the 2 texts open up some discussion about how postbellum literature participated in the process of sectional reconciliation, that is, the reunification of Union and formerly Confederate states. I'm going to focus in on these last 2 discussion points with an emphasis on how US historian David Blythe's monograph, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, has provided a useful theoretical and historical framework for these discussions. As an aside, Blythe's monograph has been invoked with some frequency in the past year in response to national events, and specifically in response to the ways in which cultural memory of the Civil War resurfaced amid the 2021 insurrection at the US Capitol. And I'm interested in thinking about some ways to potentially make connections with my students in the fall semester as well too, along those lines. Although both Alcott's and Crane's texts are set during the Civil War and feature characters with Union sentiments, they offer little discussion of slavery or specific details about the role of slavery in relationship to the conflict. Blythe argues that race was central to the choices that Americans made about how to remember the Civil War, and the three visions of memory collided and combined over time in postbellum America. And here I'm going to be quoting from Blight. One, the reconciliationist vision, which ignored the ideological divisions of the war and focused on common sacrifices by Union and Confederate soldiers and civilians. Two, the white supremacist vision, which took forms such as terror and violence and locked arms with reconciliationists and delivered a segregated memory of the Civil War. And three, an emancipationist vision, embodied in conceptions of the war as the reinvention of the Republic and the liberation of Blacks to citizenship and constitutional equality. Blight does not discuss Alcott's work and only briefly addresses the Red Badge of Courage, but this absence has actually granted us considerable space in my classes to consider how these particular texts engage in the politics and construction of Civil War cultural memory. I'm going to walk through a few passages that have been successful as starting points for class discussion, but hope also to get feedback and ideas of other passages or ways to make the discussion of these passages even more successful in the future. Little Women opens with a sketch of, quote, a little sketch of the four sisters who sat knitting away in the twilight while the December snow fell quietly without and the fire crackled cheerfully within. Students and I discuss how this opening language and imagery embodies the conventions of sentimental and domestic fiction, but we also call attention to the ways in which Jo, even in these early scenes, disrupts sentimental expectations for young women. I can only stay home and knit like a poky old woman, Jo says, and she then shakes the blue army sock till the needles rattled like castanets. We discuss how the blue army sock serves as a visual cue of the March Families Union affinities, but much like the rest of the novel, does not provide a lot of further discussion about the family's racial politics beyond this Northern identity. As we move to the next chapter, we explore the March daughters' sympathy for their neighbors, the Hummels, an impoverished German immigrant family to whom they donate their Christmas breakfast. I ask students to consider the novel's emphasis on the struggles of an immigrant family, rather than, for example, those of free people of African descent in the North. Does the Hummel family serve as a representative of other marginalized individuals? And if so, how or whom? Or does the novel's focus on class and poverty and nationality allied, more controversial discussion of sectional politics and race in relationship to the work's Civil War setting? In my teaching, as in my research, I include some discussion of the relevant biographical details from Alcott's life before we begin our discussion of these aspects of the text, such as her father's involvement in the anti-slavery movement. We discuss Alcott's revision of her personal and familial memories in relation to the broader cultural construction of Civil War memory. In contrast to Alcott's lived experience of the war, Crane was born 6 years after the end of the conflict. Much like Alcott's blue army sock, Crane introduces us to the protagonist, Henry Fleming's Union affinities via color imagery and through the language of literary impressionism. As the narrator says, the blue-clothed men scattered into arguing groups between the rows of squat brown huts. This is in the opening paragraphs of the Red Badge of Courage. I find that students often miss this cue unless I call attention to it, with some even assuming in their first papers for the class occasionally that Henry is a Confederate soldier, a confusion that can prove useful as it prompts us to consider how is the Civil War represented in this text. The narrator then goes on to describe a Negro teamster shortly thereafter. So racial representation is not entirely absent from this scene, but it arguably serves more to contribute to the novel's impressionistic backdrop rather than to offer social commentary. This has been the source of scholarly debate, but it's worth noting that this figure does not appear again or is not developed in any kind of way throughout the novel. Here and throughout the text, there is a general lack of discussion of slavery, sexual politics, and their relationship to the causes of the war, and our protagonist kind of avoids these issues as well too. Just as I use Alcott's work to illustrate but also complicate literary sentimentalism, I turn to the Red Badge of Courage to discuss its categorization as a work of realist literature, even as I encourage students to interrogate this categorization. Building upon our discussions of Little Women, I ask students to consider how Crane's work as a realist writer might add to our understanding of the role of postbellum literature in the construction of Civil War memory. One of the central plot points of the Red Badge of Courage is Henry's decision to flee from battle and then later to run towards it, ostensibly demonstrating his bravery and manhood. although the interpretation of this action has also been the source of a lot of scholarly debates, which we discuss in class. It also demonstrates how Crane, despite his categorization as a realist writer, may invoke sentimental expectations for men, and in so doing may collaborate with reconciliationist memory narratives that celebrated the shared bravery of Union and Confederate soldiers on the battlefield. Literary scholars and historians have often argued that the trauma of the battlefront may help to explain why it took so long for a novel like The Red Badge of Courage to emerge in the years following the Civil War. Blythe expresses some skepticism about this theory, given that there was no shortage of fascination with the battlefront, as is evidenced by countless military biographies and memoirs published during this time. Instead, he suggests that mainstream literary preferences for sentimental fiction may have made readers less receptive to realist depictions of war until around the turn of the century. And so here again, Alcott can prove useful as we discuss concepts like this with students. Still, as I return to classroom teaching in the fall, amid what I expect to be the continued traumatic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and state violence against people of color and our national reckoning with that violence, I'm interested in thinking about using Red Badge of Courage and Little Women to explore a series of questions with my students about literary production and trauma, national trauma. What are the challenges? What might be gained, lost, reimagined when writing amid or in the aftermath of periods of national trauma? What are the benefits and limitation of realism and sentimentalism as forms through which to express traumatic experiences? What do we make of the fact that The Red Badge of Courage, a text that veterans found so realistic in its battlefield accounts that many thought Crane had served alongside them in the Civil War, was composed by someone who had no personal, only a cultural memory of the conflict? How might Blythe's arguments provide insights into the way in which the institution of slavery is or is not represented in two of our most iconic works of Civil War literature? And finally, how might Alcott and Crane help us to better understand how Civil War memory continues to repress and or illuminate the legacy of slavery in our culture today? And that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Those were just wonderful presentations. This is a roundtable, which means that we all get to join the conversation and talk about teaching Alcott and the ways that we teach Alcott. I know that our presenters raised a lot of great questions and a lot of great approaches to teaching Alcott. It's our time now. If you have questions, feel free to just unmute and jump in. You can add them to the chat as well, or raise your hand using the reaction button. Who would like to get us started today? I noticed that one of the, I should pause more as a teacher. It's one of my teaching faults is like, I know you're supposed to take the uncomfortable pause and just let it go for a while. So I'm going to do that. I know that. So what questions do you have?
I can start.
I'm going to have Jacqueline start first.
Okay, thank you. So I was thinking about, as several of you were talking, and thank you for your really fascinating talks. I was thinking about the ways that in your classes, and I think in the circus books as well, I'm trying to formulate this in a way that makes sense, but some of these classes seem like literary classes, right? And I think a lot of you are teaching English, right? And sometimes to teachers, but to future teachers, but you're encouraging students to engage in things outside of English. David Blythe's book, for example, and I'm wondering if you would speak on that, like how you bring in, as a person who is also in the Department of English, how you bring in stuff from other fields, I guess is the question.
I think that's a great question, Jacqueline. In fact, I noted it as one of the themes of the panel is that everyone seems interested in positioning Alcott and her writings historically or temporally, though the ways you did this were very different. So how do you bring in history, context, various temporalities?
I'd like to answer that, but I haven't taught this stuff. So I took advantage of this great panel and the invitation to deal with the research I've been doing the past couple of years on children's books and circus, but I haven't taught it. I mean, I've got an idea how I would, but.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of children's books as themselves teaching. So I don't know that your work on the books is unrelated. So, but if it seems outside your scope, I mean, yeah, I think either way. I was trying to sort of engage with all of the different approaches.
It seems to me that one of the points I was trying to get at, that the children's books, the circus children's books of the Gilded Age are telling more than the story. That's obvious, I guess. But the trouble is digging into the layers and the subtexts and all of those things almost inevitably skews, because everybody assumes a kind of generic circus. But circus changed 180 degrees in the Gilded Age. So, for instance, something I didn't talk about, almost all of them talk about the abused apprentice. It is such a common trope that I call it the abused apprentice tale. And it is a constant from the 1850s on, except the trouble is there is scant evidence or fictional evidence, and it's class biased, because what it does is hide the exploitation of children in American life. So you've got the children's books who seem to be fighting the good fight against abuse, but what they're doing inadvertently is covering the better sort of people and the exploitation that is making them rich in factory and farm. So for me, a children's book is a text, and Alcott particularly, is a text for all sorts of other things. But unfortunately, until my history is written, it's the old history stuff that just talks about, yeah, of course, circus is for kids and everybody loves circus and all that kind of stuff. Running away with the circus, all those cliches. The Gilded Age invented all of those. Almost everything we think we know about circus was invented by the Gilded Age.
Thank you, David. That's great. John.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. And I taught this course BC before COVID era, and having taught in Zoom land, one thing I did a lot of was having students dive into archives, because everyone's on a computer anyway, and it's an easy way to kind of have students do something useful and they're going to staring at their computer screen, not talking. That's an amazing way to bring students into an incredible array of pretty accessible cultural, artistic, historical archives. So I would every few classes have an archive activity when they would just dive into an archive of children's books, or an archive of Civil War memorabilia, or an archive of race history, and just have them spend 20 minutes, half an hour, working in small groups, finding something interesting and coming back and then talking about how it ties into literature or reading. That's one thing I want to hang on to in the post-COVID world, when they're face to face. But they're just let students play in the archives, and it's so much easier in this kind of online interface they can use.
Kristen.
I think that's such an astute observation about the role of history that you mentioned in our presentations. And I often sort of think about how both biographical and historical approaches and Alcott, scholarship seem to go together so commonly and so effectively. And I actually made the case when I started at SUNY Brockport to allow our young adult literature class to fulfill our requirement for text and context. So a class where one of the learning outcomes, as I mentioned at the start, is for students to be thinking about the relationship between the text and its historical context, because young adult literature is so often invested in issues of social justice, and it helps to have a historical and cultural understanding of the worlds of those texts when you're talking about them. And I often almost always begin that class with Alcott, because she's an author whose work lends itself so well to historical and biographical approaches. And we can think about issues also of, which I think has come up in both of the panels quite a bit today, of revision. What does it mean to revise history, revise your life through literature, which is such an important topic for young adult literature, and also helps us to think about that relationship between text and context as well. So I think you're definitely noticing something pretty important there in your observation.
Well, somebody gets the next question ready. I just want to, I thought Jacqueline's question was great. But thinking specifically of race, which was an issue that both Elif and Kristen brought up in their papers. Like on the one hand, we know that things change. The way race gets represented changes. There are changes legally. And there are big moments like civil rights moment or Emancipation Proclamation. On the other hand, race is just is always with us as a kind of national defining feature of our history and our culture. And it's often something that's difficult and painful to address truthfully. On the other hand, it's something that is, because it seems so relevant, that I think our students are interested. I'm curious, not just about Elif and Kristen's experience, but all of your experiences. How well does it go when you bring up Alcott and race? Do you find them excited to talk about it because it seems important and relevant, even if it doesn't necessarily make Alcott into a saint? Do you find that it's difficult, that they'd rather avoid the topic? Do you find there's a tendency both to historicize things or historicize things in ways that aren't helpful? Well, that was all back then and it's all different now. Thoughts? Elif?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, for me, my students absolutely loved reading Alcott's hospital sketches. They responded so positively to this narrator, Tribulation Periwinkle. They found her so humorous, endearing. And so for them, it wasn't necessarily easy to talk about race in that book, but they really identified with the narrator and with Alcott, I guess, coming through the narrator. And they felt sort of the desire to be more open-minded or to be more empathic towards all, something that they really identified with in this day. But it was much, much more challenging to discuss race with respect to Stowe's Palmetto Leaves. I don't know if anyone here has read that book, but it's just much more, I don't know. I did have some students who found a lot of problems with Palmetto Leaves and what they perceived to be Stowe's racism towards the freed African-American population, just in terms of how, various ways in which she describes them. I mean, she does use some pretty awful metaphors. So
yes, I could see that with Stowe. I mean, Stowe's an abolitionist, but the kind of consistent racialist ways that she imagines characters is very difficult for a lot of students these days. It's and as a professor, I can say, well, yes, she was anti-racist, she was abolitionist, and look at the very racialized, racist, white supremacist ways she drew her characters. But they feel it more than that. I mean, it's not just this kind of intellectual, yes, I get it. She had these racist ways of seeing things, but they struggle with it. They dislike it. I found it Stowe harder to teach recently.
I mean, yeah, I mean, but it kind of goes back to your first point and question about context or what other sources we bring in. I mean, I do try to present these two women in the fullest way possible. You know, so they learn a lot about Stowe's background, her family background, her trials and tribulations raising 6 children, and, you know, sort of scrambling to, you know, dash this writing off to support her husband and her family. So like, I do sort of get some sympathy for her also, which does help to stave off just sort of facile, you know, anger towards her or something like that. So, I mean, I think it does also sort of tie back to how you present the authors, how much, you know, sort of contextual material you bring in. And so they don't just read the text, they see it within a much larger picture, you know.
Kristen.
Yes, I just wanted to echo that. Alcott's one of the only authors in the sort of YA literature class that I teach that I devote a whole day to biography, just of me talking to them about the author's biography, particularly with regards to social justice, you know, issues, and Bronson Alcott and his influence on her as well too. And I think that has allowed us to then be able to talk about issues of race in Little Women in sort of in that context of Alcott's life and biography, and have productive discussions about those issues as well too. But I have found that, as you know, I'm teaching this class to a group of students, many of whom are planning to become high school English teachers, and I do find that as time passes, there's increasing resistance to the 19th century texts that I teach in the class. I mean, they're very anxious to move on to the late 20th and 21st century YA texts as well too. And that's part of, as I was working on this paper, I was finding it productive to think about, you know, what does it mean to come back in the fall and be teaching Alcott, and, you know, how I make connections, help students to see the historical relevance of these works to our moment today, which sometimes they feel resistant to in my classes at least.
Is there a text, a late 20th, early 21st century text that you teach that you maybe pair with Little Women?
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's so many that I feel like students write fantastic papers about. I get many Hunger Games, Louisa May Alcott papers, many, I teach Fun Home at the end of the semester, so many Fun Home, Louisa May Alcott tomboy papers. So yeah, that's one of the things that I find really pleasurable about teaching the class, is that often as we end the class, they're starting to be able to make connections back to the 19th, you know, hopefully back to some of the 19th century materials, and write some really interesting papers on those topics too.
I have a comment about the Civil War in memory, and death also. Gaynor, that seems to be your specialty. I often like to start teaching when I'm retired now with the use of art. And I think for introducing the Civil War in memory, and I've recently written about this in a paper, The Veteran in the Wheat Field by Homer Winslow, if y'all are familiar with it. It's a post-Civil War painting, and it's very ambiguous. And I recently read an article by a guy named Steve Cohn that pointed out that ambiguous pictures lasted, not the glorious soldier on the horse kind of thing. But the ambiguous picture really spoke to people after the Civil War because their feelings about what had happened to them were so ambiguous. And of course, the Red Badge of Courage is pretty ambiguous. So anyway, just wanted to point out that I often found having a picture got people started. Good way to introduce that kind of thing, Civil War in memory.
Well,
Thank
and Kristen.
I just saying thank you. That's very helpful. I have to look into that as a possible
Yeah.
text for the class.
The Veteran in the Wheat Field. It's a picture by Winslow Homer. Beautiful masterpiece, really.
Well, and I think it addresses the question that Marlo brings up in the chat about activities that you think are worth the time in teaching these texts. And the earlier issue of just how do you bring context and history into the classroom? Art is a great way to do that. What else do y'all do? And or what would you what have you done and what would you recommend in terms of teaching activities? Historical, biographical, contextual, or?
I do a lot of work with the films as well, too, just to sort of build upon our previous panel, thinking about like, I show scenes from films across time, and we sort of look at the different incarnations and adaptations of Little Women and think about the ways in which the text has been reimagined for each generation. I stole that from my dissertation advisor. It was one of her teaching activities, but it works really well and can make for some really interesting class discussion about adaptation and revision too.
Polly and Heidi are interested in how our students of color respond to Alcott and other 19th century white writers. Thank you for those questions. Those are great.
I had something to add, perhaps. I'm always stunned by the Alcott's deep sense of poverty, or at least Louisa's view of herself as an impoverished person. And then how her life kind of lights up once she starts making money. But to me, she always had that depressed sense of not having enough money, which, you know, I tell my students she's not like Emerson with the money. She comes from I taught this last week, and I'm really tired from grading a lot of papers. A kind of impoverished, genteel family, but they suffered from poverty, and Emerson was sometimes nice to them and gave them stuff. But they shouldn't, because they always look at these writers as somehow, well, these people didn't have to work. They're not like us. Like, I had this horrible reaction to Thoreau today in a paper, like, okay, he doesn't know what we're going through, and there's no work during the pandemic, and I'm so depressed. It's so nice to see you all, so that you can talk about how we love these authors without our students saying, well, we have no kind of connection. And I think that's what somebody brought up too, like, how do you teach them today when they really want to be in the 21st century? And the 19th century seems to them what the 18th century used to seem to me, maybe. It's very difficult to teach some of these writers we love. So it was nice to hear you all.
I'll jump in and add that a lot of my students find Alcott very real in that sense of struggling to pay the bills, of the kind of uncertainty about her economic status, having to move around a lot.
But that's why I often read them parts of her diary or journals or letters to show her as a real person.
I think particularly after reading the Transcendentalists, who are often kind of, I mean, Thoreau in kind of weird ways kind of deals these things very directly, but that sense of people who are thinking about these very kind of ungrounded ideas in the way they come across sometimes, which is not necessarily fair to them, but how they come across to students. But Alcott kind of brings it home in interesting ways. And I find that for students, you know, the Black, Indigenous peoples of color students often are happy to engage in a text on its own terms and not have to kind of be the ones who speak to the racial dynamics of a certain text, let other folks deal with that. I find a lot of my work around race is putting text in conversation with each other, which is why I think it's important to have someone like Frederick Douglass or other writers of color in your course to be the people who are having the conversation together and talk about what it meant for Thoreau to fill in for Douglass at a certain point, or to have John Brown showing up at his father's house, and have the Alcott's kind of shelter and escaped slave, so that it's not just particularly on the job of the students of color to talk about what race means. That's really part of the conversation built into it. And Alcott's interesting because at times she does talk about race in great detail, very forthrightly in hospital sketches, and times she ignores it completely in Moods, for example, and in Little Women, and kind of it's a thorny question to think about race and class and poverty and who's privileged and who's not privileged in that text. And so I think the more you can build those conversations in the different texts you weave together, the better off. And that's kind of the fun of we're tweaking the class, is figuring out what the text can I bring into conversation here, either as main text or supplemental text in brief ways. Always interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, John. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, 5 o'clock on the East Coast now. And so our panel is officially about to wrap up, and I'm going to stop the recording. But before I do, are there any panelists that would like to say a final word, either about their own or someone else's presentation, or about the questions we've raised this afternoon? Okay. Seeing none, I want to thank everyone who joined us today and made time this afternoon to come and hear these excellent papers. I want to thank in particular our presenters. This was great. We're going to wrap this up, but if you would like to stay around for Alcott happy hour, we're going to stay and socialize a little bit, and we can continue this conversation. Thank you all very much. Great to be here today.